Hi, my name is Yatsu. I'm chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands, and it's a great pleasure for me today to be presenting to the Western Australia Web3 event. And as some of you may know, Animoca Brands has a proud Australian history. And so again, it's a great pleasure to be here, albeit only virtually, as I am unfortunately traveling a fair bit. Just quickly introducing Animoca Brands, we are a Web3 builder known for developing digital property rights around the space. We're probably best known for the fact that we have over 540 portfolio companies in Animoca Brands, although we're not only a investor, although that's, I guess, what we're most known for. We also build products and services, and we also own properties such as the Sandbox, for instance, or Mochaverse, and of course, our strategic partners in a variety of major Web3 companies out there. Anyway, I'm going to talk to you today about why Web3 is so important and going to cover a little bit some of the topics that might be interesting for some of you here in the audience. But maybe just to begin and outline, even though some of you may already know this, what is Web3 really and why is it so important? And we all know the history a little bit about sort of, Web 1, which is a web of read, and then in Web 2, when we had the ability to write to the web in the form of these blogs and basically chat groups and message boards and, Wikipedia, all the way we ended up sharing knowledge. And we would spend lots of time doing this. And in fact, today, actually in 2024, we spend in many countries most of our waking hours online. But when we spend our time online, we actually create lots and lots of data. And is now actually the world's most valuable resource. The biggest companies in the world are all data-rich companies. But it's not just the data in itself that is of value, it's what the data can create. Because data has gravity and has the ability to essentially create endless network effects because of the fact that the more data you compound on top of data is actually the reason why you can have things like OpenAI and Google and Apple and all these companies who actually get stronger and better and more knowledgeable and more powerful because they start collecting more and more data that is currently proprietary in the world of Web 2. And more data creates more value, which is actually unlike most other resources out there, as we can see in the world of AI. But the difference, of course, is that in Web 2, most of the data that we're generating, which then becomes blocks of information and then basically creates knowledge and these network effects, are essentially refining and creating value to network effects that we do not own. So imagine sort of, actually, this is probably what most of you do today. You're sharing photos on Instagram and it seems fun and harmless. But in reality, actually, what you're doing is you're adding value to the network that is Instagram. You're giving value to a network effect that you do not own. Those million followers you might have on Instagram, they're not your followers. Whether this be on TikTok, whether it's on Facebook or as a group, they all belong to the platforms. And these platforms today essentially are ruling over the web, much like digital kingdoms, whether it's the house of Google, kingdom of Facebook, sort of pick your pick, essentially. These are the companies today that rule most of the world today. And that's actually why Web3 is so important. Because in Web3, we now have the ability to own a piece of the internet, as in we have an ability to own the data and the network effects that we actually have created. Now, exactly how does that work? Because I guess this seems like a bit of a strange concept that how do you own a piece of the internet? And this is actually why this whole topic of tokenization is actually now so interesting as well, because tokenization is a way in which we can own pieces of these network effects, whether this is something like an Ethereum network or Solana or Mocha token or Sandbox. These are actually ways in which you can now own a piece of that network effect. And unlike other systems, they actually embed within them the network effects that are both financial and utility in nature. So when you take a look at, for instance, something like Instagram, you have the ability to have lots of followers on Instagram, but it gives you no bearing in the value of ownership of Facebook. Likewise, you could be a big shareholder in Facebook, but it gives you zero impact or bearing in terms of your influence on the network that is Instagram, for instance. They don't tie together because they're actually not the same kind of construct. They're not ways in which you can own these network effects. And actually, this is where tokenization blockchain becomes so interesting because now you have a way in which you can own these network effects through the representation of that token. But why are network effects so important? Well, to start off with, network effects is the reason why the companies are so valuable today in Web 2. And this slide, as you can see here, is a little bit old. I haven't updated it for about a half a year because many of these companies are now worth actually $3 trillion and more. But in any event, the reason why they're so valuable is because they have exclusive access to these networks. If you want to be an Apple developer, you have to seek permission from Apple and you have to pay them a fee and like a 30% profit share and follow their rules so that you can actually avail yourself to these network effects. That's how Web2 works. They build these kingdoms locked in them between themselves and have some kind of relationships between each other where some data is exchanged, but generally speaking, they're sort of more in a sort of adversarial relationship with each other. But in Web3, through tokenization, we have the ability to own pieces of these networks. And more importantly, the networks are permissionless, meaning that we now have the ability to interoperate between all of them. So this is an interesting effect, right? Because in Web2, if Apple was to grow even bigger, that's not good news for other companies in the space necessarily, because it becomes more monopolistic. But in Web3, when the token economy increases because of its permissionless nature, liquidity, assets, all these things can move freely around, essentially in this permissionless way, the entire ecosystem is lifted up as a result. So if Bitcoin increases in value or if Ethereum goes up in value, broadly speaking, the entire ecosystem wins because essentially the whole space improves because we all have ownership in it. And that's actually the other thing that's really fascinating, why we actually think Web3 is just a better model and more inclusive model when it comes to the digital world. Now, when you talk about network effects as well, one of the other kind of network effects, of course, are social and cultural network effects. And these actually come in the form of NFTs. And I often give this example between, as you can see over here, sort of this Birkin bag and a Bored Ape. And the Bored Ape today is actually much more valuable than the Birkin bag, sitting at roughly $50,000, $60,000 of value. But why would you want to own a sort of digital image, as it were, that of course you can prove through blockchain that is unique and that it is truly original and it is yours? But what's the reason you would own that? And it's the same reason why you wouldn't necessarily buy a Birkin bag so you can carry stuff in it. It's also not the reason why you buy a Rolex watch to tell the time. The utility of these things are actually a very, very small reason why you'd use it, actually, and why you want to own it. It's actually the cultural and social capital, these type of network effects that become much more valuable in terms of what it says about yourself and the status that it represents. Essentially, non-fungible tokens are a form of cultural capital, but can also be a way in which you can preserve some of that cultural capital. And I understand in Australia, of course, many topics of cultural capital and sort of cultural and social meaning, such as their indigenous population, for instance, or the deep natural history that you have in Australia, are things that are worth preserving in which networks are formed around them. You have communities that are not just local to themselves, but actually one that can extend beyond that. And that would actually be seen also in the area of sports, for instance, in the area of gaming, and the area of any kind of entertainment and cultural network effects that we see here today, whether they're small networks or large networks. And so what we can see today basically is that this type of sort of moving from tokens, as in fungible tokens, to non-fungible tokens are essentially a way in which you can essentially evolve the users from one which is mostly economic in nature. So you can see this hopefully happening in a lot of the meme coin narratives that you're seeing as of late, which is quite speculative, but also mostly economic in nature. But now they've started launching NFTs as well because they aspire to be more cultural and have more utility. And that means we're going to be seeing games develop on top of these platforms because they are communities. And you're going to see more cultural items come out of them as well. And that's actually not that different from when you think about the formation of human history. Often we make connections mostly for utility purpose in terms of trade, economic purpose, growth of some sort. And then once we form these communities, we seek other ways in which we identify ourselves and create deeper meaning. And that starts to become more social in nature. And then it becomes symbolic in terms of your reputation, whether you have a university degree, or how long you've been at your work, or what kind of respect you have in your society, which ultimately then also gets translated into a form of cultural capital. Right? So I think these evolutions that we see in the physical world are essentially manifesting themselves exactly the same way in the digital world, just in a way in which you can have ownership, which is actually what's really the foundation in the physical world that we live in. The fact that we can own these things, we can own our reputation, we can own our identity, and we can own our assets, of course, is actually the reason why we can build these type of economies is now possible in Web3, because all those digital type of reputation and assets that we can now build out, actually we can now truly own. And one of the reasons why gaming is so important in this space is because we really kind of do this today. We spend over $100 billion a year basically purchasing virtual rental goods in the form of skins and items and assets, but actually they're not really assets that belong to us. We're renting them from the gaming platforms. And exactly in the same way that we sort of look at them as social and symbolic and cultural capital, we actually do exactly the same thing in the digital world. And in fact, when you look at gaming, for instance, we have a classification in gaming in Bartle's sort of taxonomy which is, between the killers, the achievers, the socializers, and the explorers. And what's really interesting is that killers are a very, very small number of the proportion that you see over here. But then the achievers and the explorers, they represent roughly 20% of the gaming communities. These are people who just love to play the games, want to achieve something in the game, they want to explore. But the vast majority of gaming are actually right here in this sort of, social category right here, which just means that most of the people play games to actually sort of make friends and to make connections. And for those of you who have children, they're probably playing a game like Roblox. Ask them why they're playing Roblox, and a very good reason, and most of the time they will say, "Well, because my friends are playing them." Right? And it's not just because it's a fun game; it's also because so many of their friends are playing it. In fact, actually, that becomes the bigger glue. And again, the assets then in question, why people spend so much in gaming items, is because it's not about the achievement and exploration. It's about their social status, social reputation, how they stand amongst their friends and their communities, why those things matter, as it does in the real world. And the thing is, what's also interesting here is that in the sort of Web 2 world, you cannot move your reputation from one platform to another. You can't actually show that. There's no kind of interoperability of your reputation. It's not like in the physical world where if you have a degree in a good university, you can move that reputation from one job to another around the world. In Web 2, your reputation is stuck in Instagram, or it's stuck in TikTok, or it's stuck in Facebook, or it's your reputation in Roblox has very little bearing in your reputation of a game like Apex Legends, for instance. These are all islands; they don't interoperate with each other. But actually, in Web 3, because of the permissionless nature, you have the ability to transfer that reputation from place to place, which is basically what we mean by interoperability. Interoperability can also, of course, mean that there could be asset interoperability, but actually the primary use case for this is actually moving your status and your reputation from one sort of ecosystem to another. And so you can imagine a world where items can be used sort of between other places, but more importantly, also actually the users themselves can now actually market to each other based on the kind of reputations that they have in one game or the other. And again, that's, I guess, in many ways, the fabric of society. And why gaming is so critical as well. Let's not forget that actually gaming is today enjoyed by over 3.4 billion people around the world. And in fact, it is because of gaming that companies like NVIDIA have been created. Many people might not recognize that actually NVIDIA was primarily serving sort of gamers by providing them essentially GPUs for these high performance gaming needs, which is an entirely whimsical entertainment experience, if you think about it, which then eventually led to things like mining and AI and all these other things. But that came much, much later. Actually, it was really gamers that helped drive that industry. And it's also one of the reasons why we think in the same way that gaming is driving, has driven sort of the internet to where it is today, is actually going to also drive Web3 where it will go into the future. Now, there's some other very fascinating use cases that we see also in Web3. Just a few to name you an example. Open Campus, which is actually today is sort of using Web3 to kind of solve things like student loans, with better sort of yield and interest for both the investors and the students. But also an example here is that they're using things like NFTs to sort of preserve essentially their intellectual property in the form of this educational content that they can then sell on as an asset, essentially in the same way that sort of musicians and other artists and creators are able to sort of preserve their intellectual property rights and receive royalties and payments and value from that going forward. Now imagine what the music industry would have looked like if there was no IP protection for musicians. There wouldn't be a Taylor Swift, there wouldn't be a Michael Jackson, you wouldn't see any of those type of artists sort of emerge because there's no way to sort of build a foundation on this because this idea of intellectual property ownership didn't really truly exist for a long time. But once that came into play, that's actually when we were able to create a music and creative industry. But the problem is that in the current legal frameworks, it just takes a lot of money to do that. If you only make tens of thousands of dollars or maybe even just thousands of dollars a year on an asset, it's not worth the legal work and the licensing work and the trademark and the copyright for you to be able to actually build all of that as a way to sort of prove that it's yours and then essentially sort of collect royalties from that or sort of make a claim on that intellectual work that you've done. But in blockchain, through NFTs, for instance, you can actually do this type of sort of intellectual property protection at less than $1, which means that it actually allows the intellectual property protection and the assetization of any type of asset that would normally not have been considered worth protecting as something that you now can do and claim sort of, essentially royalties, ownership, or anything else, maybe sometimes just reputational ownership. And one of those sort of salient examples of those, of course, is, what's happening in AI. So most recently, well, not most recently, this was more like a year and a half ago, Getty Images was sued um, getting images sued as stability because they're essentially scraping all their data to create essentially sort of this type of sort of new images with the generative AI that they were creating. And the only reason they were able to do so is because the Getty Images watermark was visible in the work from that the Stability AI was producing. But of course, for most of us, we don't have this benefit where the work that we wrote on things like social media or the ideas that we've been spreading or the art that we've been creating, basically they just get used by this AI and with no real credit. And it's kind of ironic because when you go to college, you're always told that you have to sort of cite your sources. And it's actually interesting. You can try that when you use ChatGPT. At the end of the day, one of the habits that I usually have is when they actually end up sort of giving you an update, I would always ask them to cite their sources. And it's not only because I want to know whether they know what they're talking about, because sometimes, as we know, AI does hallucinate and sort of write all sorts of weird stuff, but also as a way for myself to actually give a kind of accreditation and credit to the sources of that material, which is kind of how we were brought up to do it. And it's just the decent thing to do. But today most people actually don't even know that. And there's only one real way to protect that ultimately, and that would be through blockchain. Because again, with blockchain technology, you can essentially protect your intellectual property right. And we believe in the future, as AI will create more and more value in the world, actually, how to share that value. And by the way, just to be clear, the value doesn't have to be financial in nature. Value doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be paid every time your content is being used in some kind of fractional way, for instance. Actually, it could also just simply be your reputation, to be given credit for the fact that your work contributed to something. And I think that's what most of us seek for. We seek the social status and the accreditation for the value that we helped create, as opposed to necessarily just sort of financial gains from it. Because from reputation, we actually then develop financial value anyway. And right now, all of that reputational value actually ends up accruing into the platforms, whether this is AI or social media platform. And again, in Web3, we have a way of actually owning that and being able to sort of prove that it is ours. And you can see this evolution also how you can use blockchain technology to counter fake news. And of course, to preserve sort of wonderful history of the past because of its immutable nature. And again, whether this is something in your indigenous history or whether this is something in the schoolwork you did or whether this is you as a musician creating something new. We have people, for instance, preserving dance moves as a way as well and actually proving who did the dance moves just by basically sort of embedding it into the blockchain. And there's a number of projects out there, for instance, such as Artifact Labs, that are actually also looking to preserve sort of newspaper articles and historical artifacts essentially on blockchain. And again, not necessarily for sort of a great financial gain, but just as a better way to sort of create a historical artifact because of its immutable nature. And of course, when you have those type of records that can trace back to the beginning, we believe that's also the best way to actually ultimately sort of counter fake news. Because right now, we sort of have to rely on centralized platforms to become the arbiters of truth, which is the problem, right? I mean, we're basically saying, Facebook, can you please be honest about stuff? But in a way, maybe they don't even know how to do that themselves. And even if they did, we're trusting a central platform to do so, when in history, that hasn't really worked. Because right now, the commodity of value today is data and information. Right? And this sort of commodity, we've seen what happens in a sort of market that's not free, when you're centralizing and monopolizing it, creates all sorts of problems and all sorts of corruption and all sorts of issues, whether intended or not. So you need a way in which this data information can actually sort of be free in the market and be open and transparent and actually become sort of in this kind of capitalist marketplace environment. And again, blockchain allows to do that in the form of tokenization. And actually, again, is a great way to sort of counter things like fake news. And of course, is another way to preserve history. So quickly, in terms of closing, sort of why is Web3 so important and why does it really matter outside of the examples I just gave? Well, perhaps the most important one, of course, is that it's actually a way in which value is distributed throughout the web through the entire ecosystem of users. In Web2, really generally the investors and of course the entrepreneurs and builders receive the lion's share of the value. And very rarely do creators get a little bit of value. As you can see, basically it's a very small amount over there. And of course, users basically get almost nothing, right? And the reason why users get almost nothing is because right now you're the product, right? You're sharing photos and you think you're having fun, but you're basically pouring in your time and energy to create content that you receive no value for, even if you might think it's de minimis, but actually it creates these trillion-dollar companies in which you don't have much value whatsoever. Whereas in Web3, actually the end user receives a lot of value, sometimes even more value, because they're the ones who provide the engine of growth for these products and services. And this happens in the form of airdrops, if you've not heard of that. And last year, up until the end of 23, so I don't have updated numbers for 24, close to $22 billion of airdrops was given. And many people say, oh, this is like free money, for instance. Isn't this kind of nonsense? But actually, it's just the inverse of marketing. Because think about how much money is spent in marketing. It's trillions of dollars a year that we spend in marketing. In gaming alone, we spend over $100 billion basically marketing to what? To an effect, to acquire users, of course, right? But of course, when you pay Apple and Facebook and Google all this money, all these billions of dollars to acquire users into your games or your products or your services, how much of that money goes actually to the users who you're actually advertising to get into? It's zero. And how much of that money, at least in the gaming industry, goes actually into developing gaming studios or enhancing game products or making the gaming experience better for the actual players, for instance, or for the game studios involved? Zero as well, right? Basically. So, in other words, there's a highly extractive tax that happens in this form of marketing and advertising in the Web2 world that can now actually be distributed to the end users in the blockchain industry. So, if it means kind of instead of you paying Facebook on Instagram as an example to sort of advertise a product or platform, you're essentially paying the users that you want to use a product, platform, or service value directly. And you can do this now in the form of airdrops and build your own customer bases. And by the way, airdrops don't have to be just in the form of fungible tokens. They can also be in the form of NFTs. When you give a free mint, for instance, or a low cost mint, that's kind of akin to essentially giving a kind of airdrop to acquire customers and users. And there's many ways, which we can optimize on that. That's kind of one of the reasons why Mochaverse, what we're doing with the Mochaverse is so important, because it's a way to sort of help acquire high quality users, people who have good reputations in the space. But maybe that's for another topic. All right. So, as a result of this way in which we distribute value across Web3, where essentially everyone's going to have a stake in this new internet and also obviously benefit from that through the form of these airdrops or other services or other benefits, we believe that actually this will ultimately solve one of the big problems we have in the day, which is essentially the growing sense of inequality around the world, sort of the distrust in capitalism. And that's frankly because we don't really live in a sort of in a fully capitalist world as might have been imagined, because it's not really a free market. The market is essentially, when you're buying advertising on Facebook, it's the market of Facebook and they decide, for instance, right? And Apple isn't really a marketplace. Apple decides everything. They decide who can launch an app. They can decide who can be seen. They can decide who can advertise. That's not a free market. That's essentially, a monopolistic environment that actually is more close akin to sort of state control and almost a more sort of heavily socialist type of environment than actually a true free market environment. So, that's what we think Web3 will solve, again, because of the permissionless nature. And we think as a way of sharing all that value, we actually create a new kind of capitalism that is more akin to kind of stakeholder capitalism. And this is basically where we think the future will go in Web3 and why it's such an important space for all of us. Because digital property rights in Web3 actually truly allows for the growth and potential for these property owning, sort of a property owning democracy, and for organizations that are run in a more democratic manner, and also allows for the voice to come out for those who basically maybe felt like they didn't have one before. And this means that we're merging from a world where we're going from company-owned internet platforms to community-owned internet platforms. A good example of this would be, for instance, like, Bitcoin or Ethereum. Who owns and runs Bitcoin? Who owns and runs Ethereum? Yes, there's a few companies that have more than others, but generally speaking, it's the entire community that runs it. If it was actually centralized, if most of the hash rates of Bitcoin was owned by one company, or if Ethereum was only run essentially by a few companies, this value would never be formed the way that it is, because it's not owned by the community and it can't be trusted. And so we believe that the largest companies in the world in the future are not going to be the classical company-owned internet platforms. They're going to be the community-owned internet platforms through tokenization. And we see some early inklings of that already. When you, for instance, look at decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, as they're sort of often commonly known, today there's over $30.6 billion of value that is now governed by close to 11 million people. And over 3.2 million people are actively voting on these proposals about how that funding is spent to build in their ecosystem. I can't think of a single company, organization, or framework in the world that actually operates in such a decentralized, democratic manner, where billions of dollars is governed by millions of users. And we believe it will be millions of more in the future, because essentially, once most of the world will be on Web3, these governance token holders and the ones who decide essentially how things are funded and how things are organized in the future, where DAO values won't be 30 billion or 40 billion, but will be possibly hundreds of billions, if not $1 trillion or more, basically underscored and underpinned by all the value that we see in Web3, we think that's going to be the future. And it's one that's actually much more fairer and democratic than what we have today. So quickly, in closing, skip the slide here. In closing, I think you've seen and this is of course true in places like Australia, that per capita income highly correlates to property rights. The more property rights you have, generally, the more trust you have in an ecosystem, and the more GDP. And when you look at certain other countries, like we see here, right over here, the countries like places like North Korea, for instance, you have very low property rights, and they tend to be amongst the poorest in the world. So there's a clear correlation that in any environment where you have strong property rights, you have better GDPs, better economies, higher trust, and interestingly enough, also higher degrees of liberty. So, my closing statement here, I think George Washington said it best when he said, freedom and property rights are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. And the same is true for digital property rights and digital freedom. You must have digital property rights in order to have digital freedom, so that we can actually live a better and fairer life in the future, especially in the digital world. And that's only possible, we think, today in Web3. Thank you so much for your time.